The heater in my truck barely worked, but I kept the engine idling just to keep the windshield clear of the heavy October fog. From across the street, I had a perfect view of Dominic's property. It was a sprawling, immaculate colonial in the wealthiest zip code of coastal Maine, the kind of house that demanded respect just by existing. I sat in the driver's seat, a cold cup of diner coffee in my hand, watching the heavy oak front door. At exactly 7 in the morning, the door swung open. Dominic stood there wearing a pressed cashmere robe, his usual confident politician's smile already plastered on his face. But the smile faltered. It didn't disappear, but the edges tightened. He was looking at 2 uniformed officers standing on his porch, their breath pluming in the cold air. They weren't holding clipboards, they weren't there for a neighborhood donation drive. I rolled down my window just a fraction of an inch, listening to the muffled, tense exchange over the hum of my engine, and felt a strange, quiet settling in my chest. It had taken a month to build the mechanism that brought them to his door, and like any good machine, it was finally running perfectly on its own. To understand how we got here, you have to understand the difference between my brother and me. Dominic built things that took up space. He was a commercial real estate developer, a town councilman, a man who shook hands with a firm grip and always remembered the names of people's children. I fixed things that most people forgot existed. I was a horologist, a restorer of antique clocks and nautical chronometers. My hands were permanently stained with brass polish and oil, and I spent most of my time in a cramped workshop that smelled of sawdust and old metal. We also had a more defining difference. Dominic was the golden child. I was the one who had spent my late 20s in and out of rehab for a prescription painkiller addiction. I had been clean for 10 years. 10 years of quiet, tedious, unremarkable sobriety. I paid my taxes, kept my head down, and built a modest reputation among collectors. But in a small historic town, a reputation is a fossil. It never really changes its shape. To the local bank managers, the country club members, and especially to Dominic, I was always going to be the liability, the unsteady younger brother who needed to be managed. Our grandmother, Eleanor, was the only person who saw me differently. She had been a master watchmaker herself, one of the few women in the guild back in the 60s. When her eyesight failed and her hands began to tremble, I became her hands. I spent every Sunday at her house, adjusting escapements, cleaning mainsprings, and listening to her talk about the physics of time. Dominic rarely visited. He was always busy with zoning board meetings or golf tournaments. But when Eleanor's health took a sharp decline late in the summer, Dominic suddenly became intensely interested in her welfare, specifically her assets. Eleanor wasn't wealthy in the traditional sense. Her house was heavily mortgaged, and her savings were meager. But she owned 3 mid-19th century marine chronometers. They were boxed in solid mahogany, gimbal-mounted brass masterpieces that were used for celestial navigation before the invention of radio signals. In the world of maritime antiques, they were museum-grade artifacts. Together, they were easily worth the price of a small estate. 6 months before she passed, Eleanor asked me to bring the chronometers to my workshop. We sat at her kitchen table, and she pushed a meticulously typed legal contract toward me. It wasn't a will, it was a transfer of custodial rights and a commission agreement. She officially hired me to completely restore the 3 instruments, document their provenance, and secure their placement with a specialized auction house in Boston. The contract stipulated that my workshop was the sole legal custodian of the pieces, and upon their sale, the proceeds would clear her debts, with the remainder split evenly between Dominic and me. She knew her mind was starting to cloud, and she knew Dominic's business was over-leveraged. She wanted the chronometers safe from his creditors. We had the documents notarized by a traveling clerk she trusted, and I moved the heavy mahogany boxes to my climate-controlled vault in Portland, miles away from my daily workshop. We kept it quiet. When Eleanor died 3 weeks ago, it was a quiet, somber affair. I managed the arrangements because Dominic was supposedly in the middle of closing a massive commercial development deal. But the day after the funeral, Dominic went to Eleanor's house with an appraiser. He walked straight to the glass cabinets in the study and found them empty. He didn't call me to ask where they were. He didn't come to my shop. He went straight to work on the town. It started subtly. I went to the local hardware supply store to pick up some specialized solvents, and the owner, A guy I'd known for 20 years refused to put it on my tab. He looked at the floor, muttered something about new accounting software, and asked for cash. 2 days later, my largest local client, a retired judge who was having a grandfather clock restored, called and cancelled the commission, demanding his deposit back. Then came the whispers in the diner, people stopping their conversations when I walked in. I finally cornered Isaac, Dominic's ambitious 20-something assistant, at the coffee shop. I bought him a heavy espresso, boxed him into a booth, and asked him what was going on. Isaac looked terrified, but his loyalty to Dominic had its limits when confronted directly. He admitted that Dominic had been making the rounds. Dominic had sat down with the town council, the local police chief, and the business association. He told them, with apparent heartbreak, that I had relapsed. He claimed that the stress of Eleanor's death had pushed me back to the pills, and that I had stolen our grandmother's inheritance, the 3 chronometers, to fence them for drug money. Dominic's strategy was brilliant, because it relied on an old truth. Everyone remembered the erratic, desperate version of me from a decade ago. Dominic didn't scream his accusations. He weaponized pity. He told everyone he was trying to handle it internally, that he didn't want to press charges if he could just get me into a facility. But he warned the local businesses not to extend me credit or give me cash. He effectively cut off my oxygen, isolating me, starving my business and turning my community into a wall of suspicion. I drove to Dominic's office that afternoon. He didn't look surprised to see me. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking immaculate while I stood there with brass dust on my jeans. He offered me a seat. I didn't take it. I told him I knew what he was doing. He leaned back, intertwining his fingers. He didn't deny it. Instead, he slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a relinquishment form. It stated that I would forfeit any claim to Eleanor's estate, including the house, and in exchange, he would graciously decline to press theft charges. He looked at me with a mixture of contempt and false sympathy. He told me I looked tired. He said people were worried about me. He told me that if I just returned the chronometers, he would personally pay for my rehab. He was incredibly convincing. If I didn't know I was sober, I almost would have believed him myself. I realized then that this had nothing to do with preserving family legacy. I spent the next 2 days digging through public property records and municipal zoning filings at the county clerk's office. I had always been good at tracing the history of an object, following the paper trail of ownership. I applied the same methodical research to Dominic's business. It didn't take long to find the rot. His flagship commercial project, a luxury waterfront complex, was stalled. He had over-leveraged his assets, taking out massive bridge loans with a regional bank. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it yesterday just to keep the bank from calling in the debt. Eleanor's house wasn't enough to cover it. The chronometers were his lifeline. He needed to sell them immediately, quietly, on the grey market, avoiding auction house fees and tax declarations. But he couldn't do that without the physical objects, and he couldn't report them stolen to the police without generating an official investigation that might uncover Eleanor's custodial contract. So he chose character assassination. He was applying social and financial pressure, hoping I would break, hand over the boxes, and disappear in shame. I couldn't fight him in the court of public opinion. I had no credibility there. If I showed the town the contract, Dominic would just claim I forged it, taking advantage of a dying woman. I needed him to make a move that bypassed local gossip and triggered an irreversible external consequence. I needed him to steal something that was legally mine. I called Simon, the senior appraiser at the Boston auction house who had been working with Eleanor and me. Simon was a meticulous, humorless man who cared exclusively about the integrity of antiquities. When I first contacted him after the rumors started, he had been distant, clearly having heard the whispers from his own circles. I didn't try to convince him of my innocence with a tearful plea. I simply sent him a certified copy of Eleanor's custodial contract, my detailed restoration logs, and the high-resolution macro photography of the chronometer's escapements I had been working on. I spoke his language: evidence, documentation, precision. Simon agreed to a meeting. I drove down to Boston and laid out my plan. It was risky, and it required Simon to leverage his institution's resources. He hesitated. He told me that if this went wrong, his auction house would blacklist me forever. But he also despised the grey market art trade, and the idea that Dominic was trying to fence museum-grade maritime artifacts to cover bad real estate loans offended him on a professional level. Simon agreed to help. The first step required a sacrifice. The 3 chronometers were safe in a vault, but I needed Dominic to think he had broken me. I took the smallest of the 3, a subsidiary dial piece, incredibly valuable but slightly less historically significant than the other 2, and brought it back to my workshop in Maine. Before I moved it, Simon and I installed a specialized micro-GPS asset tag. This wasn't a cheap consumer tracker you put on your keys. It was an active transponder used by international art registries, embedded seamlessly inside the hollow cavity of the mahogany base, sealed with original period hide glue so it was invisible to the naked eye. We officially registered the piece under my workshop's LLC with the Art Loss Register, a global database used by law enforcement and customs. Back in Maine, my business was bleeding out. I couldn't pay the rent on my workshop. I was eating cheap soup and avoiding the glare of my neighbors. It was humiliating, and there were nights I sat in the dark, questioning if I had the stamina for this. The isolation was a physical weight, but I let the desperation show. I went back to the diner when I knew Isaac was picking up Dominic's lunch order. I looked a mess. I hadn't shaved, my clothes were rumpled, and my hands were shaking, mostly from too much caffeine and exhaustion, but it looked like withdrawal. I practically cornered Isaac by the counter. I kept my voice low, panicked. I told him I was in trouble. I said I had moved one of the boxes back to my shop, that I was trying to find a buyer in Montreal, but the deal fell through. I begged Isaac to ask Dominic for an advance, a loan, anything. I made sure Isaac saw the desperation. I knew exactly where that information was going. I left the chronometer in a locked cabinet in my shop. I didn't upgrade the security. I didn't sleep there. I went home and waited. 3 nights later, I got a call from my landlord at 2 in the morning. My shop's back door had been forced open. When I arrived, the local police were already there. The cabinet was smashed. The chronometer was gone. The next few hours were the hardest part of the entire ordeal. The local police chief, a man who played golf with Dominic every Sunday, questioned me with open skepticism. He looked at the broken cabinet, looked at my haggard appearance, and practically accused me of staging the break-in for insurance money. He casually mentioned my history, asking if I was currently under the care of a physician. He refused to send a forensics team. He took a basic report, handed me a card, and told me not to leave town. The next morning, my landlord evicted me. He said he couldn't afford the liability of having a known addict running illegal operations out of his building. I spent the day packing 10 years of my life, my tools, my workbenches, into a rented storage pod, while the neighboring business owners watched from their windows. I had lost my workspace, my local reputation, and a piece of my grandmother's legacy. But sitting in my truck, looking at the tracking app on my heavily encrypted laptop, I saw the transponder ping. The chronometer hadn't gone to a pawn shop. It hadn't gone to a drug dealer. It had moved 30 miles south, stopping at a high-end, climate-controlled commercial storage facility near the interstate. I didn't call the local police. They wouldn't have believed me anyway, and Dominic would have been tipped off immediately. Instead, I drove down to the facility and watched from a distance. The unit was registered to a shell company. It took me 3 days of digging through state corporate registry filings, cross-referencing mailing addresses and registered agents, to definitively link the LLC to Dominic's primary real estate holding company. Dominic was sitting on it, waiting for a buyer. And because he was arrogant, he thought he was completely safe. I waited. I kept tracking the transponder, checking it every hour, barely sleeping. Simon kept me updated from Boston. We knew Dominic was desperate. His loan extension with the regional bank was expiring at the end of the month. He had to move the piece. A week later, the transponder pinged again. It was moving, but it wasn't just moving within the state. It was traveling south, crossing the state line into New Hampshire. That was the fatal error. The moment a stolen, high-value cultural artifact crosses a state line for the purpose of illicit sale, it ceases to be a local property dispute. It becomes a federal crime, involving interstate commerce and the National Stolen Art File. Simon made the call. As an authorized institutional representative, he contacted the FBI's art crime team and the regional interstate task force. He provided the custodial contract proving I was the legal custodian, the registration documents of the piece, the time-stamped logs of the break-in at my shop, and the live tracking data of the transponder, showing the artifact currently resting at a private aviation terminal in New Hampshire, addressed to an anonymous buyer. The federal authorities moved with a quiet, devastating efficiency that the local police could never match. They intercepted the package on the tarmac, they retrieved the chronometer intact, and they traced the shipping manifest directly back to Dominic's shell company. But I wanted the consequences to reflect the exact nature of his betrayal. Dominic had tried to ruin me financially and socially, leveraging his reputation against my past. So I targeted the foundation of his reputation. Simon, utilizing his auction house's vast financial network, contacted the compliance department of the regional bank where Dominic was finalizing his massive commercial loan. Simon simply provided them with a courtesy notification. One of their primary clients was currently under active federal investigation for interstate trafficking of stolen antiquities, and the assets he was using to secure his ongoing credit lines might be subject to seizure. Banks don't care about local gossip or family disputes, they care about risk, and federal indictments are the ultimate risk. Which brings me back to the cold October morning in my truck. I watched Dominic standing on his porch. The two officers weren't the local cops he played golf with. They were state investigators, accompanied by a federal agent in a plain suit. They weren't there to ask polite questions. They were executing a search warrant for his home office, seizing his electronics and financial records related to the Shell LLC. I couldn't hear the words being spoken, but I could read the shift in Dominic's posture. The arrogant slouch vanished. His hands, usually gesturing expansively, were rigid at his sides. The officers stepped past him, entering his immaculate house. Dominic stood on the threshold looking out at the street. His eyes scanned the parked cars, the morning fog, and finally settled on my truck. Even through the misted windshield, I knew he saw me. He knew exactly what had happened. The gears had finally locked into place. I didn't roll down the window to shout at him. I didn't feel the need to gloat. The victory wasn't a sudden burst of joy. It was a heavy, quiet relief, like setting down a massive weight you've been carrying for miles. His reputation, carefully curated over decades, was currently being dismantled in his own living room. The bank would pull his loans by noon. The town council would demand his resignation by the end of the week. His empire of influence was dissolving because he had assumed I was too broken to fight back. I put the truck in gear. I drove away from the wealthy estates, heading south toward Portland. I had secured a small, well-lit workspace in a warehouse district near the docks. It wasn't much to look at, but the security was ironclad, and the rent was covered by an advance from Simon's auction house. They had officially taken on the sale of the 3 chronometers, including the one recovered from the tarmac. When I unlocked the door to my new shop, the smell of fresh wood and machine oil greeted me. I walked over to my bench, where the 2 remaining mahogany boxes sat, waiting to be finished. I opened the lid of the primary chronometer, revealing the intricate brass workings, the balance spring, the delicate hands. I picked up my loop, fitted it to my eye, and reached for my tweezers. There was a profound silence in the room, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the escapement. It was a sound that had guided sailors across vast, terrifying oceans for centuries. It was the sound of something functioning exactly as it was designed to, steady, reliable, and entirely beyond the reach of anyone else's control. I bent over the gears, found my focus, and went back to work. The raid on Dominic's Colonial was the lead story on the local news by 5 o'clock that evening. They didn't have all the details yet, just footage of federal agents carrying sealed plastic bins out of his front door. My phone, which had been silent for weeks, suddenly started vibrating with texts from numbers I hadn't saved in years. People from the hardware store, neighbors, even the retired judge who had cancelled his commission were reaching out. I didn't answer a single one of them. I left the phone on my workbench, letting it buzz against the wood, and focused on the escapement in front of me. I thought the federal raid was the end of it, the final mechanism clicking into place to secure my peace. I was incredibly naive to underestimate my brother's instinct for self-preservation. Dominic didn't stay in custody for long. By Wednesday, his high-priced defense attorney had arranged bail and issued a blistering press release. They spun the entire FBI investigation as a tragic misunderstanding, a clerical error regarding interstate shipping regulations entirely orchestrated by a disgruntled, mentally unstable family member. The narrative Dominic was pushing shifted overnight. I was no longer just the tragic, addicted younger brother who stole to feed a habit. I was now a malicious saboteur trying to frame a pillar of the community to steal his rightful inheritance. The real blow came on Friday morning. A process server showed up at my new warehouse space. He handed me a thick stack of legal documents. Dominic's legal team had filed an emergency injunction in probate court, claiming that Eleanor's custodial contract was a fraudulent document. They argued that her cognitive decline in her final months rendered her legally incompetent to sign away the chronometers, and worse, they insinuated I had forged her signature outright. The injunction effectively froze the remaining 2 chronometers. Simon called me an hour later, his usually steady voice laced with genuine anxiety. The auction house could not legally list or sell the pieces while ownership was under active litigation. Until a judge ruled on the authenticity of the contract, the chronometers were essentially dead weight, and Dominic's lawyers were preparing to bleed me dry with legal fees I couldn't possibly afford. I sat in the dim light of the warehouse, looking at the 2 locked mahogany boxes. The exhaustion was a physical ache in my bones. For the first time in 10 years, the thought of numbing it all, of just walking away and finding a pill to quiet the relentless noise, felt terrifyingly close. It was a familiar, heavy whisper in the back of my mind. Dominic knew exactly what he was doing. He was applying a different kind of pressure now, attrition. He had the resources to keep this tied up in court for years, while I had nothing but a rented workbench and a rapidly depleting advance from Simon. I realized I couldn't rely solely on the federal criminal case. The FBI was building a trafficking case against Dominic based on the tracker, but the local probate battle over the contract's legitimacy was a separate war, one I had to fight on my own. I needed to prove Eleanor was fully lucid when she signed that document, and I needed the notary who stamped it. Her name was Margaret Hayes. She was a retired paralegal who did mobile notary work around the county. A friend of Eleanor's from a historic preservation society they both belonged to decades ago. When I tried calling the number on the notary stamp, it was disconnected. I spent the weekend haunting the county archives and cross-referencing public records, trying to track her down. The local community, meanwhile, was completely fractured. Some people had seen the FBI raid and realized Dominic was dirty, but others, the wealthy investors, the town council members who relied on his developments, rallied around him, convinced I was the architect of a massive smear campaign. When I went to the grocery store, the silence in the aisles was deafening. I was a ghost in my own hometown, caught in a purgatory of pending litigation. By Tuesday, I finally caught a break. I found Margaret's name on a property transfer deed in a neighboring coastal town. I drove there immediately, my old truck rattling along the wet coastal highway. The address belonged to a modest, assisted living bungalow complex. When Margaret opened the door, leaning heavily on a cane, she looked at me with sharp, clear eyes. She remembered Eleanor perfectly, and more importantly, she remembered the exact day we signed the contract. But when I explained the injunction and asked her to provide a sworn affidavit testifying to Eleanor's state of mind, Margaret hesitated. She gestured for me to sit in her small living room. She explained that her son worked as a site manager for one of Dominic's construction firms. Dominic had already reached out to him. He hadn't made a direct threat. Dominic was too smart for that. But he had casually mentioned that the upcoming layoffs at the firm might affect middle management, especially those whose families were involved in messy legal disputes against the company. Margaret was terrified that helping me would cost her son his livelihood. I sat on her floral sofa, the air thick with the smell of peppermint tea and old paper. The injustice of it was suffocating. Dominic was using his failing financial empire as a weapon to silence a 70-year-old woman. I couldn't force her to testify. I wouldn't do to her what Dominic was doing to everyone else. I thanked her for her time, left my number, and walked back out to my truck, feeling the cold Maine wind cut right through my jacket. I drove back to the warehouse in silence. If I couldn't use the notary, the contract would likely be thrown out. Dominic would reclaim the remaining chronometers, sell them to cover his debts, and the federal case might falter if the underlying ownership of the stolen piece became a murky family dispute rather than a clear-cut theft. I needed another way to prove Eleanor's intent. I needed something Dominic couldn't intimidate or manipulate. I unlocked the warehouse and turned on the overhead lamps. I pulled the first chronometer, the largest of the three, the one with the complex double escapement, onto the center of my bench. I had been restoring it purely functionally, cleaning the gears, oiling the pivots. But Eleanor was a master watchmaker. She understood the permanence of metal. She didn't trust paper, she trusted mechanics. I put on my highest magnification loupe. I didn't look at the dial or the obvious serial numbers. I disassembled the movement completely, separating the heavy brass plates that housed the intricate gear train. I spent hours brushing away decades of micro-dust and oxidized oil, examining every millimeter of the interior brass housing under a harsh halogen light. It was meticulous, agonizing work, the kind of focus that makes you forget to breathe. Just past midnight, I found it. It wasn't a document. It was an engraving. On the inside of the lower main plate, completely invisible unless the entire mechanism was dismantled by a professional, were words etched into the brass with a micrograver. It was Eleanor's distinctive, sloping script, cut directly into the metal. It read, "Restored by my hands, entrusted to my grandson, to be sold together to preserve his future." Below the text was a date, 2 weeks before she signed the contract, and her unique maker's mark. She had known. She had anticipated Dominic's greed, and she had bypassed the fragile nature of legal paper entirely. She had built her true will directly into the artifact itself, ensuring that only someone who possessed the skill to care for the machine would ever find it. I sat back, pulling the loupe from my eye, and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs for a month. The proof wasn't something Dominic could contest with a lawyer. It was physically integrated into a museum-grade antiquity. I took high-resolution macro photographs of the engraving, documenting the oxidation patterns to prove it hadn't been recently carved. I sent the files securely to Simon in Boston. Within 20 minutes, despite the late hour, my phone rang. Simon's voice was electric. He told me this didn't just prove intent, it dramatically increased the provenance and historical value of the piece. An internal, hidden dedication by one of the few female master horologists of her era was a collector's dream. The next morning, Simon didn't just send the photos to Dominic's lawyers. He filed them directly with the probate judge, accompanied by a sworn statement of authenticity from the auction house's chief antiquities director. We had the irrefutable proof. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Dominic was officially out of options, out of money, and out of time. I knew the legal victory wasn't enough to make him stop. He wouldn't just surrender to bankruptcy and federal charges quietly. I carefully packed the brass components away, locked the heavy steel door of the warehouse, and prepared myself. The final confrontation wasn't going to happen in a sterile courtroom. It was going to happen tonight. I didn't turn off the overhead lamps in the warehouse. I wanted the light to spill out through the high frosted windows into the empty industrial lot, serving as a beacon. I sat at my workbench in the quiet, the smell of machine oil and sawdust grounding me, and watched the digital feed from the newly installed security cameras on my laptop. It was just past 2 in the morning when the headlights of a heavy SUV swept across the brick wall outside. The vehicle parked haphazardly, tires mounting the curb. The door opened, and Dominic stepped out into the freezing coastal drizzle. He didn't look like the man who had stood on his porch in a cashmere robe a few weeks ago. His trench coat was unbuttoned, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and his movements were erratic, stripped of their usual calculated grace. He was carrying a heavy steel crowbar. I watched the screen as he approached the reinforced steel service door. He didn't try to pick the lock. He wedged the crowbar into the frame and threw his entire body weight against it. The metal groaned. I had intentionally left the heavy interior deadbolt unlocked, relying only on the standard handle lock. I wanted him to get inside. I needed him to cross that threshold on his own terms. With a loud crack, the door gave way. Dominic stumbled into the warehouse, the crowbar gripped tightly in his right hand. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the expansive room until they locked onto my workbench. There, sitting perfectly centered under the harsh halogen light were the two polished mahogany boxes. He walked toward me, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. He didn't look remorseful. He looked cornered and furious. He stopped a few feet away, raising the heavy steel bar slightly. He told me I had ruined him. His voice was a raw, desperate rasp. He said the bank had formally issued a notice of default on his loans that afternoon. His investors were pulling out, and his development firm was going into emergency receivership. He blamed me for not accepting his offer, for not just disappearing quietly and letting him handle the family assets the way he always did. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him, realizing for the first time how hollow he actually was. All that influence, all that power, relied entirely on the illusion of success. The moment the foundation cracked, the entire structure collapsed. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the wooden boxes. He said the probate judge hadn't officially recognized the engraving yet. He told me that if the brass plates were destroyed, if the physical evidence ceased to exist, my photographs would be dismissed as digital fabrications. He raised the crowbar high above his shoulder, aiming directly for the center of the largest chronometer box. I didn't flinch. I just watched as he brought the steel down with a sickening crack, shattering the antique mahogany, splintering the wood into a dozen jagged pieces. Dominic froze. He dropped the crowbar. It clattered loudly against the concrete. He was staring into the ruined box. It was completely empty. I reached over and closed my laptop. I told him that Simon and I hadn't just filed the photographs with the probate court. We had also submitted them to the federal agents handling his trafficking case. Because the chronometers were now classified as key physical evidence in a federal investigation, the FBI had sent a secure transport team to my warehouse 6 hours ago. The actual brass movements, including Eleanor's engraved nameplate, were currently sitting in a federally guarded evidence vault in Boston. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, and his shoulders slumped. He looked at the shattered wood on my bench, then looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant. The red and blue lights began flashing through the frosted windows before he could say another word. Simon hadn't just arranged for the transport of the chronometers. He had also notified the task force that Dominic, facing total financial ruin and federal indictment, was highly likely to attempt evidence tampering. They had placed a surveillance team outside my warehouse just after midnight. By breaking down the door and destroying what he believed to be the evidence, Dominic had just added a string of severe federal obstruction charges to his rapidly growing list of crimes. The warehouse door swung wide open, and 3 armed federal agents stepped inside. They didn't yell. They didn't have to. The authority in the room had shifted permanently. Dominic didn't resist. He didn't try to talk his way out of it. The politician's smile was gone forever. He simply turned around, put his hands behind his back and let them lock the cuffs around his wrists. As they led him out into the rain, he didn't look back at me. The following months were a quiet reconstruction. Dominic's empire was dismantled piece by piece in bankruptcy court. He took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, resulting in a substantial federal prison sentence for interstate trafficking and wire fraud. The local paper covered his downfall obsessively, but I rarely read the articles. The probate judge dismissed the injunction immediately once the physical engraving was authenticated. With clear legal ownership established, the auction house in Boston moved forward with the sale. The collection of 3 chronometers, elevated by Eleanor's hidden dedication, sparked a bidding war among maritime museums and private collectors. The final sale price was staggering. I used my half of the proceeds to clear the remaining mortgage on Eleanor's house, transferring the deed into a protective trust. I didn't move back into it. Instead, I bought a small, brick-faced commercial building in Portland near the historic seaport. It had massive, south-facing windows that flooded the space with natural light. People from my old town eventually tried to reach out. The hardware store owner sent a long, apologetic email. The retired judge called and asked if I had time to take on his grandfather clock again. I was polite, but I declined. I didn't need to rebuild my reputation in a place that had been so eager to believe the worst of me. I had a new clientele now, serious collectors and museums who communicated through Simon, people who valued the integrity of the work over local gossip. It was late afternoon on a Tuesday when I finally finished unpacking the last of my specialized tools in the new shop. The sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air. I sat at my new heavy oak workbench and opened a small leather-bound case I had kept off the auction block. Inside was Eleanor's personal pocket watch, a simple, unadorned silver piece she had carried for 40 years. It had stopped running the day she died. I picked up my tweezers, set my loop to my eye and gently nudged the balance wheel. The tiny mechanism caught, the spring engaging with a crisp, microscopic click. The rhythmic, steady ticking filled the silent room. It was a perfect, continuous motion, reliable and true. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the sound, feeling the absolute stillness of a life that finally belonged entirely to me.